The snow was falling sideways through the black smoke of the Hurtgen forest, each flake turning red as it drifted past the flames. The forest floor was alive with the crack of gunfire, the low groan of wounded men, and the metallic whisper of tanks idling in the dark. In the middle of that chaos stood Oberstleutnant Karl-Heinz Wolf, commander of the 3rd Panzergrenadier Regiment, staring at a sheet of paper that trembled in his gloved hands. His breath came in clouds, his eyes fixed on the wax seal of WWII command, orders marked Vorrücken bis zum letzten Mann. Advance until the last man. He looked toward the trees where his soldiers crouched, shivering and bloodied, half of them no older than 19. The enemy, American infantry of the 28th Division, was dug in somewhere beyond the ridge, their artillery pounding the forest into ash. Wolf tore open the envelope, read the words once, twice, then without a sound held the page over the barrel of a burning half-track. The paper curled, blackened, and vanished into sparks that drifted upward into the frozen air. His adjutant watched in disbelief. "Herr Oberst, your orders." Wolf said nothing. He turned to his men, voice hoarse but steady. "Tell them the line has moved. We're not dying here for Berlin." The decision would ripple through the forest, through divisions on both sides, and before dawn, the Americans would look out across the battlefield expecting one last assault, and find instead a silence so vast, they thought it was a trick. The snow did not stop for 3 days. It fell thick and soundless, blanketing the wreckage of tanks, the splintered trees, and the frozen bodies that marked the Hurtgen line like grave markers for a dying army. The 3rd Panzergrenadier Regiment, what was left of it, huddled in dugouts scraped into the mud and ice, their breath fogging inside helmets as they shared the last of their rations and prayed for dawn that never seemed to come. Oberstleutnant Karl-Heinz Wolf, 41 years old, once a teacher from Bremen, now a man with a map etched into his face by exhaustion, moved among them like a shadow. His uniform, once field gray, had turned the color of ash. His collar tabs dulled, his boots cracked from the cold. He stopped at each foxhole, touching shoulders, checking bandages, handing out what cigarettes remained. There was no talk of victory anymore, only of holding the line, of surviving another hour. When the message runner from Division HQ had arrived that night, carrying the sealed envelope with the Black Eagle crest, Wolf already knew what it contained. The Führerhauptquartier demanded a counterattack, an impossible order from men who had never seen this forest, who believed courage alone could stop American artillery. Wolf had taken the paper, thanked the messenger, and waited until the boy was gone before opening it. The words inside were pure madness. Immediate assault on enemy positions west of Wassenach. Objective: retake lost ground. Failure will be regarded as treason. He read them twice, then laughed, a dry, broken sound that frightened even himself. Around him, his officers watched in silence. Hauptmann Dieter Krantz, his adjutant, barely 26, spoke first. "Herr Oberst, this will kill what's left of us. We have no fuel, no ammo, half our men without boots." Wolf stared into the fire, the paper still trembling in his hand. Outside the dugout, the forest groaned under the weight of ice, the air thick with the smell of cordite and pine sap. "Berlin believes courage can replace shells," Wolf said quietly. "But courage does not stop a Sherman." He rose, his movements deliberate, and stepped into the open night. Snowflakes spun in the air like drifting ash. The sky pulsed orange where artillery burned the horizon. He held the order over the flames of a shattered barrel, the ink running before it blackened, curling into nothing. The act took seconds, but it felt like the collapse of an empire. Kranz's voice came from behind him, trembling. "Sir, if we disobey—" Wolf turned, his eyes cold. "Then let history decide whether we were soldiers or men." By morning, he had rewritten the orders himself. Simple, measured, believable. Regiment to hold defensive positions. Reinforcements delayed. Await further instructions. The message was sent up the chain, the falsified dispatch encoded in standard cipher. Somewhere between the static and the snow, Berlin would receive silence and assume obedience. In truth, Wolf's men began to dig deeper, build cover, ration ammunition, and prepare not to advance but to endure. Across the line, the U.S. 28th Infantry Division, the bloody bucket man, was listening too. Their scouts reported movement, expecting another desperate German push. Instead, what came that night was nothing. No attack, no mortars, no screaming charges through the trees. Only the wind and the slow creak of ice on broken branches. American artillery officers peered through their binoculars, waiting. When the silence stretched too long, they fired probing shells. The Germans did not answer. Some thought the enemy had withdrawn. Others thought it was a trap. But in truth, it was something far rarer on that front, an act of quiet rebellion hidden behind snow and radio static. Inside the German line, men began to understand what their commander had done. Rumors spread in whispers that Wolf had burned his orders, that he had defied Berlin. For the first time in months, the soldiers spoke without fear. They reinforced positions, shared coffee heated over small fires, patched boots with torn canvas. Even the wounded who could still lift a rifle returned to the line, not because they believed in victory, but because they believed in the man who had chosen them over madness. Krantz confronted him that evening in the shelter of a ruined observation post. "Herr Oberst, if this reaches high command," Wolf cut him off, "then I will hang. But if it doesn't, these men will live." His tone carried neither bravado nor fear, only weariness, the calm of someone who had already made peace with the cost. On the second day, an American patrol stumbled into the German perimeter, expecting resistance and finding instead a strange, uneasy truce. The Germans fired warning shots, then held their line. The Americans withdrew, confused. Reports filtered back through Allied channels. Enemy dug in, not advancing. Appears defensive. Commanders chalked it up to attrition, never realizing the truth, that one man's disobedience had slowed the slaughter of an entire sector. By the third day, snow buried the dead so completely that the forest seemed to breathe again. Wolf walked among his men, his greatcoat flaring in the wind, the burned edges of the original order still tucked into his pocket like a relic. He knew it was only a matter of time before someone higher up noticed the absence of gunfire. When they did, Berlin would send another message, and this one he could not burn without consequence. But until that day came, Wolf swore the Hurtgen would remain silent. Around him the world collapsed. Armies moved, cities burned, and the Reich's heartbeat grew faint. Yet in that tiny pocket of forest, an exhausted regiment held its breath not in fear but in defiance. And when the snow finally stopped falling, the men of the 3rd Panzergrenadier rose from their dugouts and saw something none had witnessed in months. The sun, pale and thin, pushing through the clouds. For a fleeting moment, the light touched the blackened helmets, the frostbitten faces, and the tattered flag, still clinging to a broken antenna. It looked absurdly like hope. The forest had become a living thing, breathing, shifting, whispering in the cold. By late November, the Hurtgen no longer belonged to either army. It was a graveyard with branches. Every stump hid a corpse, every foxhole a frozen story. Snow crusted over helmets like burial shrouds, and the stench of smoke and death mixed so completely that one could no longer tell them apart. The 3rd Panzergrenadier Regiment, now reduced to less than half its original strength, had vanished from Berlin's maps. To the high command, they were just another unit lost in the woods, cut off, presumed destroyed. But inside that silence, Oberstleutnant Karl-Heinz Wolf had built a fragile world where his men could breathe again. He had forbidden offensive patrols, rationed ammunition to the last round, and ordered his medics to treat prisoners of war alongside their own. It was treason in every sense but mercy. The men followed without question. They began to call the forest der Atem Gottes, the breath of God, because for reasons none could explain, artillery never seemed to strike the same clearing twice. Perhaps it was luck. Perhaps fate was simply too tired to aim. At night, they could hear the Americans across the valley. The sound of laughter, faint harmonicas, men singing off-key in the dark. The enemy was close enough to smell the smoke of their fires, close enough that sometimes voices drifted between the trees. In that strange twilight of war, boundaries blurred. One evening, a wounded American stumbled through the fog toward their lines, bleeding from a leg wound, whispering for help. The sentry raised his rifle, but Wolf himself appeared, stepping from the shadows, and ordered the man brought inside. The soldiers stared as their colonel knelt beside the American, binding the wound with his own scarf. "He is a soldier," Wolf said simply. "The war will decide who wins, not us." They fed him soup, gave him morphine, and when dawn came, left him near the tree line with a white cloth tied to a stick. Hours later, American stretcher bearers found him alive. They never knew whose hands had saved him. Still, the forest did not forgive easily. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of winter grew unbearable. Frostbite spread like disease. Rations dwindled until men boiled snow just to feel something warm in their stomachs. The radio was their only link to the outside world, and even that grew quiet. No orders came from Corps HQ, no calls, no reprimands. It was as if Berlin had simply forgotten them. Wolf preferred it that way. The less they remember, the longer we live, he told Krantz, who now looked 10 years older than his age. But not everyone shared his conviction. Unteroffizier Weber, a hard, loyal man from Saxony, whispered of betrayal, of dishonor, of what would happen when the SS found out. One night Weber vanished. By morning they found him in the snow near the northern slope, shot twice, execution style. Wolf said nothing. He buried the man himself, marking the grave with nothing but a bayonet thrust into the ice. "The forest takes who it wants," he murmured. As December crept in, rumors began to swirl through the Allied lines. Patrols reported hearing German voices not shouting but singing, old folk songs drifting through the fog at night. Some swore they saw lanterns moving in patterns, signals perhaps, but none could explain why there were no attacks, no ambushes, only silence. The Americans called the sector the dead zone. Commanders avoided it, preferring to press the assault north where progress at least could be measured in yards. The Hurtgen became a scar left to fester, yet inside that scar life continued in its stubborn, haunting rhythm. The soldiers of the 3rd Panzergrenadier scavenged American rations from wrecked supply trucks, shared them with the villagers who still lived in cellars at Wassenach and Kammerscheid, and built crude stoves from shell casings. They no longer saluted when Wolf passed. They nodded like farmers acknowledging their elder. He had become something else entirely, neither officer nor rebel, but the keeper of this cursed forest. Then one bitter dawn, the silence broke. A reconnaissance plane high above the snow line spotted movement, camouflage nets, fires, tracks. Within 48 hours, Berlin knew the 3rd Panzergrenadier was still alive. The order came down the chain with brutal clarity. Re-establish contact and prepare for counteroffensive in support of Operation Wacht am Rhein. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble. The forest that Wolf had turned into sanctuary was about to become the anvil of a new storm. Krantz brought him the telegram, his hand shaking. "Sir, they want us to move west." Wolf said nothing for a long time. He stood by the window of the command hut watching snow drift down like ash and whispered, "Then we will burn again." That night he gathered his officers. The candlelight flickered across their faces, gaunt, hollow, waiting. "Berlin wants a miracle," he said, "but we are not prophets. We are the last ghosts of a dying army. Tomorrow we move, not to attack but to vanish," and so they did. When dawn came, the Americans heard the sound of engines echoing through the valleys and assumed the counterattack had begun. But when they advanced, they found only empty trenches, fires still burning, rifles stacked neatly beside abandoned helmets. The 3rd Panzergrenadier had melted into the forest, moving south under cover of fog, civilians hidden among them, wounded carried on sleds. Behind them, the snow filled their footprints until it was as if they had never existed. Some said Wolf was leading them toward the Eifel, others that he meant to surrender to the Allies on his own terms. No one knew for sure. All they knew was that an entire regiment had defied orders again and disappeared. They left the Hurtgen under a sky the color of lead. Engines coughed and sputtered as the convoy wound south, the remaining half-tracks dragging sleds loaded with wounded ammunition and the remnants of their humanity. Oberstleutnant Karl-Heinz Wolf rode in the front vehicle, a captured American jeep stripped of insignia, its headlights blacked out. Behind him stretched a line of ghosts, the 3rd Panzergrenadier Regiment, or what was left of it. Perhaps 400 men from the 3,000 who had once marched through France singing the songs of victory. Now no one sang. The only music was the creak of axles and the moan of the wind through shattered trees. They moved by night, navigating by the stars, slipping through the woods like a migrating herd too stubborn to die. When they passed through villages, the few remaining civilians came out of their cellars to watch. Old women clutching rosaries, children staring at the tattered uniforms. Unable to tell if these were saviors or the condemned, the men shared what little they had, a can of beans here, a scrap of bread there. In the morning, they were gone, leaving only footprints and cigarette smoke. By December 16th, the forest behind them was alive with thunder. The Ardennes offensive had begun, and across the front the German army was throwing its last reserves into the snow. Yet Wolf's regiment did not join the assault. They marched in the opposite direction, away from the sound of glory, deeper into the woods near the Our River, where the front was shifting faster than any map could track. "Sir, if we keep going this way, we'll end up behind American lines," Kranz warned. Wolf nodded. "Then that's where we belong." His voice was soft, almost tender. He had realized that salvation lay not in obedience but surrender, not to Berlin but to life itself. And so his plan, whispered in the dark and sealed with silence, was simple: to deliver his men, those still breathing, into Allied hands without another shot fired. But it was easier dreamed than done. Patrols prowled the woods, SS units scoured the countryside for deserters, and rumor had it that the Gestapo had been ordered to execute any commander who failed to advance. On the third night, they reached the outskirts of a ruined village called Hellenthal, where smoke from the Ardennes front painted the horizon crimson. The men took shelter in the church, its roof half gone, snow drifting through the rafters to settle on the pews like ashes. Inside, Wolf stood before the altar, his breath clouding in the cold, and spoke to his officers for what they all knew might be the last time. "We will not go to Berlin," he said. "We will not kill for a lie. We will cross the river tomorrow and lay down our arms." No one argued. Even Krantz, who had once begged him to follow orders, bowed his head. The men slept that night among broken icons and the faint smell of candle wax, their rifles stacked beside them like relics of another faith. At dawn, as the first light seeped through the holes in the roof, they moved toward the river. The cold cut through their coats, the water black and fast under thin ice. On the opposite bank, beyond the trees, lay the faint glimmer of Allied campfires. A handful of men crossed first, using fallen logs as bridges. Wolf followed, his boots slipping on the frost. Halfway across, a shot cracked from the northern ridge, SS scouts hunting deserters. The bullet struck one of the men ahead, spinning him into the current. Chaos erupted. "Go, move!" Wolf shouted, waving his pistol toward the opposite shore. The men scrambled across as more shots echoed. Krantz returned fire blindly, tracers slicing through the mist. When they reached the far bank, only half their number remained. Wolf turned to cover the rear, his face pale with fury. "Keep going!" he yelled, but Krantz hesitated, refusing to leave him. Together they dragged the last survivors from the river before retreating into the tree line. By then the firing had stopped. Whether the SS had given up or simply lost sight of them, no one knew. What mattered was that they were alive, barely. For 2 days they hid in the woods, their uniforms drying stiff from river ice, their nerves raw from exhaustion. American patrols passed close enough that they could hear the crunch of snow under boots, the jingle of canteens. Finally, on Christmas Eve, they made contact. An American sergeant from the 99th Infantry Division found them in a hollow, rifles laid out in a neat line, hands raised. "We're done fighting," Wolf said in halting English. The Americans didn't believe it at first. They surrounded the group, guns raised, expecting a trap. But when they saw the wounded and the frostbitten, the boys barely standing, they understood. The sergeant lowered his weapon. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "You poor bastards." The men were searched, disarmed, and marched toward the rear. No one spoke. Snow began to fall again, gentle this time, covering the footprints of both prisoner and guard. By nightfall, the 3rd Panzergrenadier no longer existed. Not on paper, not in Berlin, not in the field. It had dissolved into the forest like smoke, surviving not through victory but through surrender. As they entered the American camp, the men looked around in disbelief. Tents, food, warmth, music from a radio. Wolf paused at the gate, staring at the flag fluttering above, the stars and stripes glowing faintly under the searchlights. Krantz stepped beside him. "What now, sir?" he asked quietly. Wolf exhaled, the breath rising like fog. "Now," he said, "we start living like men again." The prisoner camp near Eupen was a sea of wire and mud, where the defeated German army huddled beneath the gray Belgian sky like cattle waiting for judgment. It was January 1945. The Ardennes offensive had already failed, the last gamble of a dying Reich spent in snow and blood. Oberstleutnant Karl-Heinz Wolf arrived with his men under guard of the 99th U.S. Infantry Division, their rifles slung, faces hidden behind exhaustion. When the Americans took his name, they hesitated at the rank. "Colonel, huh?" the guard said, scanning the list. "You don't look like much of one." Wolf gave a faint smile. "I was once." They stripped him of his sidearm and medals, handed him a tin bowl. and sent him to the officers' enclosure, a barbed rectangle of frost and silence where the ghosts of Germany's command waited for their fates. Around him sat generals who still spoke in clipped Prussian arrogance, men who blamed the weather, the Americans, anyone but themselves. They wore their defeat like a temporary inconvenience. Wolf ignored them. He sat alone near the fence, staring at the snow, thinking of the forest, the faces of his men, and the paper he had burned. The Americans didn't know what to make of him. His record was incomplete, his regiment unaccounted for. The U.S. Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, interrogated him for days, searching for hidden divisions, for orders he might have ignored or destroyed. "Why did your unit surrender intact?" they asked. Wolf looked up from his hands. "Because it was intact," he said, "and I wanted it to stay that way." They asked if he had disobeyed Hitler's commands. He replied, "I obeyed Germany." "They are not always the same thing," his calm unnerved them. One officer described him in his report as an enemy who no longer believes in enemies. Weeks passed. Prisoners came and went, some bound for trial, others for repatriation. Wolf remained, a curiosity, the colonel who refused to kill and refused to die. In the camp, his men whispered his name like a secret. They had expected him to be executed, shot for treason by their own side or quietly disposed of by the Americans. But neither came. Instead, Wolf began to organize the chaos around him. He helped medics tend to the sick, translated for the guards, even brokered peace between feuding prisoners, former SS who spat at him and Wehrmacht soldiers who now saw him as something greater than a commander. "You burned the order?" one young grenadier said one night, eyes shining in the firelight. "That means we live." Wolf nodded but said nothing. In his heart, he knew the war would not end with victory or surrender. It would end with memory. The forest still lived inside him, the snow, the silence, the faces of boys who had sung in the dark. He had not saved an army, only fragments of one, but perhaps that was enough. Spring came slowly. The snow melted into rivers that carried away the last traces of winter and blood. The guards relaxed. The wire sagged. Rumors spread of Hitler's death, of Berlin in ruins, of a new world rising from the ashes. One morning, an American officer called Wolf to the command tent. "Colonel," he said, lighting a cigarette, "war's over. You're free to go." Wolf stood in silence. "Free?" he repeated, the word strange in his mouth. "Where does a man like me go now?" The officer shrugged. "Anywhere but back to that forest." They shook hands, soldier to soldier, and that was the end of it. He left the camp with nothing but a coat, a map, and the memories that would never let him sleep. He walked east, through towns that no longer had names, through fields that once held battles and now only ghosts. He saw the Reich broken, its eagles fallen from stone, its banners rotting in gutters. In Cologne, he saw a cathedral standing amid rubble, its spire untouched, and for the first time in years he felt something like faith, not in nations or orders, but in endurance. He kept walking until he reached the Rhine, where he stood for hours watching the river flow, remembering the one he had crossed with his men, the one that had carried them from soldiers to survivors. Years later, those who had served under him would tell stories of the colonel who burned his orders, of the regiment that vanished, of the night the forest fell silent. Historians would argue whether it was desertion or courage, whether he was a coward or a savior. But the men who lived because of him never doubted. They would gather in quiet rooms long after the war, raising glasses not to victory but to the silence that had saved them. Somewhere in the records of both armies, a line remained uncorrected. Unit status unknown. Presumed destroyed. In truth, it was only one man who had destroyed something, not his unit, but the machine that demanded their sacrifice. And in doing so, Karl-Heinz Wolf had done what no order could command. He had remembered what it meant to be human. In the spring of 1946, Germany was a wound that refused to close. The air still smelled of smoke and iron, of burned cities and damp stone. Across the Rhine, ruins stretched like ribs from a carcass, and between them walked people who had forgotten how to look up. Oberstleutnant Karl-Heinz Wolf had returned not as a soldier, not even as a man of the Reich, but as one of millions drifting through the ashes of a country that no longer existed. His uniform was gone, traded for a worker's coat. His name carried no power. He slept in barns, walked along railway lines overgrown with weeds, and listened to the wind move through the shells of churches. Every night he dreamed of the forest, the snow, the silence, the men who had followed him, and every morning he woke with the same question in his throat. What had it all been for? He reached Bremen, or what was left of it, in June. The city of his birth was a skeleton of chimneys and blackened bricks. The Weser River thick with debris. Children played among the wreckage, their laughter sharp against the silence of a dead economy. In what used to be a schoolyard, British soldiers handed out powdered milk. Wolf stood among the line of civilians, his breath shallow, waiting for his turn. When one of the soldiers recognized his accent, precise, educated, he asked what he had been before the war. A teacher, Wolf said softly. Then an officer. The soldier looked at him for a long time and nodded. Then you've seen too much of both. That night, Wolf slept in the ruins of his old school. The walls scorched, the desks overturned, the blackboard still bearing the faint chalk traces of lessons never finished. He sat there for hours, staring at a single word scrawled across it, Heimat, home. The following months were a slow unlearning. The Allies dismantled what was left of the Wehrmacht, tearing down symbols, rewriting textbooks, purging names. Wolf watched it happen without anger. He volunteered to clear rubble, to rebuild bridges, to teach children how to read again. But every face he saw reminded him of someone lost. The young medic, the boy with frost-bitten fingers, Krantz with his quiet defiance and steady eyes. Sometimes he thought he saw them among the crowds, shadows crossing the streets. Once in a displaced persons camp, he found a familiar name on a roster, Hauptmann Dieter Krantz. Alive, listed as a repatriated prisoner in France. For a week, Wolf couldn't eat or sleep. He wrote a letter, just a few lines, unsigned, telling Krantz that the forest still remembered them, that silence had saved more lives than gunfire. He never knew if the letter was delivered. By autumn, the trials in Nuremberg had begun. The radio crackled with voices from another world, judges, prosecutors, men defending the indefensible. Names he had once obeyed now echoed in disgrace. When the verdicts came, Wolf sat in a small tavern with other veterans, their faces pale under the weak light. Some cursed, some wept. Wolf simply stared at his drink. They were only following orders, someone said. Wolf looked up, his voice barely a whisper. That's what they all say, until someone burns them. The table fell silent. No one spoke to him again that night. He left before dawn, walking into the fog, the echo of his own words following him like a ghost. As winter returned, the scars of the war began to freeze into permanence. Cities were rebuilt, borders redrawn, flags replaced. Yet beneath the surface, old loyalties stirred, quiet but unbroken. Wolf saw it in the eyes of men in breadlines and the way they spoke of honor and betrayal. He heard whispers of secret veterans groups, of officers planning memoirs to rewrite the story, to paint defeat as tragedy, not guilt. One day an old comrade found him clearing rubble near the Schnorr quarter, his hands blistered and raw. "Karl," the man said, "they're gathering near Hanover. They say Germany needs men like us again." Wolf turned, the dust settling around him like ash. "Germany needs men who know when to stop." The man stared at him, confused. Wolf picked up his shovel and kept working. That night the comrade disappeared. The years passed. The forest grew back over the Hurtgen. Farmers returned to plant where artillery had once fallen, their plows unearthing helmets, bones, rusted rifles. The Americans called it the Green Hell Reborn. In 1950, a group of forestry workers uncovered a buried identification tag, 3rd Panzergrenadier Regiment. It was sent to the new authorities in Bonn, where someone filed it under recovered. No one connected it to the story of the colonel who had burned his orders. That legend lived only in the memories of the few who survived. They met sometimes those who had followed him into silence in small gatherings that drew no attention, men who now wore civilian coats and carried grocery bags instead of rifles. They would raise glasses quietly and one would whisper, "To the forest." Another would answer, "To the man who defied Berlin." And they would drink, eyes down, hearts heavy. In the end, Wolf lived alone on the outskirts of Hamburg, in a small cottage left behind by a family that never returned from the East. He tended a garden, read books, and listened to the river. Visitors came sometimes, students, journalists, historians, all wanting to know the same thing, why he had done it, why he had burned his orders. His answers were never the same. To one he said, "Because I was tired of killing." To another, "Because I wanted my men to live." And to one young writer who asked if he regretted it, he replied, "Every day, and not at all." When they left, he would return to his window where the sunlight caught the dust like falling snow. He would close his eyes and see the forest again, the men, the silence, the burning paper curling into black ash. In 1963, on a clear autumn morning, a postman found him dead in his chair, a cup of tea still warm beside him, a book open on his lap. He had marked a single passage with a pencil line. "Obedience is not virtue when it serves madness." They buried him quietly, without military honors, in a civilian cemetery near the Elbe. Only a handful attended, his former students, a few surviving soldiers, and one American officer, now old and gray, who placed a folded note on the grave. It read, "He ended a war for a few hundred souls." That was enough. Years later, historians would rediscover the story. The burned order, the vanished regiment, the colonel who walked away from history. Some called him a deserter, others a hero. Monographs were written, documentaries filmed, scholars debated his motives. But in the end, the truth was simpler and far more human. Karl-Heinz Wolff had been neither a saint nor a traitor. He had simply refused to let men die for a line on a map. His rebellion had not saved Germany, but it had saved a piece of its soul. And in a century defined by obedience, that was revolution enough. Today, deep in the Hurtgen, where tourists hike through moss and silence, there is a stone half buried by time. The inscription, worn by rain, reads only, "Hier schwieg der Krieg." Here the war fell silent. No one knows who placed it there. But every winter someone leaves a small wreath of pine branches at its base. On misty mornings when the wind moves through the trees, one might almost imagine the echo of boots on snow, the faint murmur of men breathing together, alive only in memory. And if you listen closely beneath the sound of the forest itself, you might hear it. The faint crackle of paper turning to flame, and the voice of a man whispering, "Let it end here."